What's up, YouTube? So today we are going to talk about photography basics, episode 3, I believe. We are on episode 3. The reason this episode is particularly important is because we are going to learn how to shoot manual. And as terrifying as that sounds, I'm actually going to make it very, very easy. I'm going to try to breeze through this whole talking so we can get out there and actually film and take pictures of stuff. All right, so part 1. There's 4 things that are really important to know. They change all the time. So there's white balance, shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. I'm going to explain every single one, the basics of what they do, and a general rule of what I keep my settings around. Let's get into it really fast. So ISO, okay, that's the easiest one to get out of the way. It's the easiest one to understand. So your ISO is basically artificial light that your camera can add if the image is too dark. The reason ISO is a thing is because sometimes you have your aperture set where you want it and your shutter speed set right where you want it, but the image is still too dark. So what the ISO does is it basically adds just a little bit more light. And what I mean by artificial, it's basically like just digital light. It's not actually there. So you raise that and it brightens up your image. Here's the thing with that though. All right, so just to show you guys an example with ISO real quick, I'm gonna lower this all the way down. Okay, so basically I have my aperture set at the lowest it can go, and I have my shutter speed set at the lowest it can go in order to, so you can see the surroundings. So it's still dark, like I said with ISO. Oh look, I can make it brighter. That's great, right? Well, here's this thing. So this is pretty good ISO right here. But then this light goes out, then it's dark again. So what do we do? And right now my camera's having trouble focusing because there's not enough light. So I raise it again. It's barely enough to focus, so raise it again. Now if you start to notice, there is some grain, like right in here, you can see it. And over here where I'm trying to focus, there's not enough light, so I'm gonna raise the ISO again. Now it's like really bad. Yeah, you can see it now. It's like just really grainy. This is what happens when you raise your ISO too high. Just really grainy. So yeah, your photos are gonna have a lot of grain like that. So if there's any circumstance where you have to raise your ISO this high, you might as well make the photos black and white, because black and white photos generally look pretty decent when they're grainy, but color photos not so much. So, general rule of thumb, keep your ISO as low as you possibly can. When I'm indoors, I try to never ever push it past 6400, at least on Canon. Sony, that's a different story, but for Canon, don't push your ISO past 6400, general rule of thumb. 32's pushing it like a lot, but 6400, I mean, that is like, do not go past 6400 ISO, video or photography. Just don't do it. Just keep that in mind. Keep ISO as low as possible. When I'm outside, I usually keep it about 100 to 800 at the very most. You might get up to like 6400 or 3200 if you're filming, you know, in really dark places. But when I'm outside, broad daylight, nothing really past 800. I usually, as soon as I get outside, it's usually either at 100 or 200 ISO max in broad daylight. The other thing to keep in mind about ISO is it's in like it starts at 100 and doubles. At least on the Canon camera I have, the ISO doubles. So it starts at 100, then goes to 200, then 400, 800, 1600. But yeah, so that's how you know the ISO. You're changing that. It also sometimes, well, on mine, it has a little box in the top left corner that says ISO. All right, next easy thing, we're gonna talk about aperture, okay? So, with aperture, you see movies or pictures and they have like the blurry background and the foreground is in focus. That is an aperture trick. Basically, the lower your aperture is, the more blurry of a background you're gonna get. So right now, mine is at 2.8, which is why there's not a lot, because you know it's 2.8, but there's some background blur here. The lower your aperture is, the more blurry of a background you're gonna get, and a sharp foreground for the most part. There's some different rules with that. But basically, if you want a blurry background, lower your aperture is, the more blurry it's going to be in the background. Just be careful when you do this, because sometimes if you shoot completely open, which just basically means the lowest aperture your lens can go, you will lose sharpness in the foreground sometimes, so keep that in mind. Aperture is measured in a decimal. Zoom lenses, like the fast ones, start at 2.8 and work their way up. Prime lenses can be like 1.2, 1.4, like really wide open. Aperture is measured in f-stops, so if you hear somebody say f2.8 or f4, they're just talking about the aperture that the lens is set at. On your average, it goes from 2.8 to about f22. That's your average aperture length. But just to review aperture real quick, the lower the number is, the lower your aperture is, the more blurry your background is going to be. I usually, whenever I'm taking photos or shooting video, I usually have my lens wide open, which is probably a really bad habit that I need to fix, but that's usually what I do. Next thing we're going to talk about, shutter speed. Okay, so if you've ever seen pictures that you're trying to take, like let's say you're trying to take a picture of your friend or something doing a skateboarding trick or just that's moving, and there's a lot of blur in the picture. So basically that means you have a very slow shutter speed. So on this one, the higher your shutter speed is, the more in focus that your moving subject is going to be. Basically what that is there's a shutter, right? And how a photograph works is there's light that comes into your sensor, and that's basically what makes the photo. So what your shutter speed does, that's the amount of time that your shutter allows light to get to your sensor. So with the faster shutter speeds going like, you know, you're gonna capture more motion, whereas a slower shutter speed is gonna be like, doom, doom. So that time in between where your shutter, where the light gets to your sensor and the shutter closes, opens and closes, if there's more time that happens, then it's gonna have more motion blur because there's more light being exposed. But if it's a faster shutter speed, less light's being exposed or let into the sensor, so it's quickly capturing the motions. One of the most important things when it comes to understanding how to shoot manual is white balance. Because if you've ever noticed how you pick up a camera and sometimes it might be blue or like really yellow, like for example, if it's really yellow inside, you have to change your white balance to something that's more blue. I don't really know how, because there's Kelvin involved in other cameras, how they do their white balance. I've never really done that because I just use the settings that are on my camera. It's really easy. There's daylight, cloudy, white fluorescent, tungsten, stuff like that. Right now I'm using cloudy, but that's only because the light that I'm using is kind of mimicking like daylight. So that's why I'm using a cloudy white balance, because it's more closer to what you would see outside than it would be inside. However, when I'm inside, I either use white fluorescent or tungsten, because those two are going to give you the most realistic lighting while you're inside. But for outside, I either stick with cloudy or daylight. Shade is a little too, I don't know, it's a little too saturated for me, so I just stick with cloudy or daylight. But yeah, so if you're, you know, using white balance or whatever, just, if you're outside, stick with daylight or cloudy. I usually always use cloudy no matter what. And then if you're inside, tungsten or white fluorescent, that actually depends on the color of your lights. If your lights are more red, it's hard to explain, but if you have more of a red color coming off your lights, I would use tungsten. Whereas if you have more of a blue or very white light coming off of your indoor lights, I would use white fluorescent, and that would be the best one. All right, guys, so that's enough of me jabbering, all right? Let's go out, let's shoot some photos. Hopefully by the time you're done with this, you'll be a pro.
All right, guys, so that's about all that I got for you today. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, 2020 style. Thank you. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any more comments or questions, please comment down below and I will answer them. So Have a great day, guys. I'm out.